Hey everybody, welcome to my jewelry design course with Blender 4.2. In my course, you're going to learn how to design a lot of different pieces of jewelry for 3D printing and casting and become somewhat of a functional and proficient jewelry designer. In this course, we're going to cover setting up Blender, using Blender. I mean, there's going to be probably 50 or 60 different video lessons, but I want you to get familiar with, from the start, how to set up Blender, how to get it all organized and ready to use as we move into every part of each lesson. Blender is a really cool program. It has a lot of different features. I typically use it only for 3D modeling. I do some animation work for it, but mostly 3D modeling, and that's kind of what I'm going to teach you here, mostly geared towards jewelry design. We're going to add in a few add-ons to use with Blender and become a lot more proficient with it as we move on. Here's a quick index of this video and what you'll find here. You can skip to these sections that you see here if you need to, or come back and use them as a reference. So here I just want to show you a few of the thousands of models that I've made over the years. I've been using Blender productively since 2012, and it's worked out very well for me. And as the program continues to become enhanced, it's actually much more easier to do certain things. I don't just do jewelry designs. When I do CADing, I also do 3D game models and 3D characters. That's something that we've focused on a little bit over the years, and it's also gotten me more and more familiar with Blender. But for the most part, I've been doing jewelry design since 2012, and I work with this program pretty much every single day. Now you can see from these designs, I've done quite a few, and you can see I'm showing you rings, pendants, I've done earrings, I've done bracelets, links for certain things. So there are a lot of designs that you can do within Blender using its basic features and a couple of add-ons. We're going to cover some of the add-ons in another video, but for now let's just get started on getting this set up. Let's get started with the installation and setup of Blender. The first thing you're going to have to do is go to the Blender website. That website is www.blender.org, or just blender.org. When you get to this website, you'll see that you're at the Blender website, where you can find information, see its features, download files, support, get involved, all the little things that Blender does here. But the most important one is at the time of this recording, we're using Blender 4.2 LTS, and the whole course is going to be based on this version. So I want you to go and hit the download button. Don't worry about which version of an operating system you're using, because when you click on the download button, it's going to bring you to the download page. Depending on which operating system you're currently running, you'll see the download option right here for whatever version you're using. Now I'm using a Mac Apple Silicon version, so it's automatically detected that, and it will allow me to download the correct file. If you're using a Windows PC, it'll come up with the Windows version of that. And if you're using an older Macintosh that has an x86 processor in it, it'll come up with the option for that also. Linux, the same. Go ahead and download Blender. I'm assuming that you all know how to install applications on your computer, so I'm not going to cover that, but we're going to continue with this as we first launch Blender, and the screen we get will be this. Okay, so here's the opening screen of Blender. Now, what you see here are several little windows that are appearing. This main window here is called the 3D viewport. This 3D viewport is used pretty much with most of these tabs up here. It allows you to select objects, rotate your screen, zoom in and out, add and remove objects from your collection. And we'll cover that in a little bit, but we're not going to do that right now. I just want to cover what some of these things are. We have a tools menu on the left. This tools menu can be hidden with the T key. So if you press the T key, you'll see the tools menu goes away. Press it again and it comes back. So any tool that's associated with any one of the operating tabs they'll all be slightly different, but you can show it and hide it with the T key. One of the other things that you'll need to do is get familiar with the N tab panel. The N tab panel is, it's called that because you press the N key to bring up that N tabs panel. And I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Press N, and I've got my cursor in the 3D viewport. And you'll see that these little tabs here show up when you press the N key. If you want to hide that, press the N key again, and it goes away. In addition to that, I typically leave the end tabs open all the time when I'm modeling. I'll hide them occasionally if I need more space in my 3D viewport, which is the big area. So from the 3D viewport, we'll go to the outliner. The outliner lists all the objects that are in your scene. Your 3D viewport shows your scene. So here we have a scene collection, and then we have an object collection here. And in that object collection, we have a camera. If I click here, you can see it highlights the camera. We have a cube, which is the default Blender cube, and we have a light. So we can make changes, select these, edit, control them, move them anywhere we want within our scene or our 3D viewport, and we'll have them in our collection. A lot of times what I like to do is change these around a little bit because I like to be able to turn off some environmental objects so that I don't select them when I'm working on particular models. We'll cover that either in this video or another video when we're doing a setup. So once you've understood that this panel here, the objects or the outline panel, and you can see it's called outline just by putting your mouse over here and hovering, it'll bring up a little box that shows you what it is. When we add objects to our scene, they will appear here. Now on the lower half of this part of the screen, we have this other panel that has tabs on it, and we have our tool tab, we have a render tab, we have a format tab for our rendering. This panel here is our layers tab. We're not gonna use a lot of these. I'll cover them as we use them. We are going to use the scene tools because these scene tools will have to change to set up to work with jewelry. We have our world options, and I'm going to show you how to set up your environment later on in another course or another lesson where we can do some rendering and make our renders look a little bit real. We have our objects parameters, our physics parameters or light parameters. These are our constraints. I'll cover constraints in another lesson. And then we have, for instance, we have our light selected, so we have functions for our light. If I change this to the cube, you will see that now we have all the parameters for our cube. So we can basically change the way this lower half looks because it's tied to whatever object you have selected. For instance, if I click on the camera, this lower half from here, this lower half here kind of corresponds to the camera, and so on. So if I click the light again, you can see this lower half now applies to the light. When we first install Blender, by default, it gives us a timeline. Now, that is going to be used for things like animations or if you're doing video editing. Because this jewelry course does not cover animations or video editing, we're going to remove this at some point later on in this video as we get set up. And then we have our toolbar at the bottom, which gives us, like we have a dope sheet here. If we click on the right mouse button, the left mouse button is change frame, and this all corresponds to our tool tab. If I click here in the 3D viewport, now you can see it's changed to address the functions of the viewport settings. You can see now I can hit the left mouse button and select. I can right click on it and get an object's properties and change certain things, which we'll be covering as we again go through the lessons. So these are the things that you need to know when you first install it and just get a little bit familiar with Blender. There is another area that we're going to cover quite a bit, and that is in the Edit menu. So we come down to Edit and Preferences, and this brings up a new window which has all the preferences for Blender. Now I've gone ahead and reset my Blender application to its default settings, so I should be working with Blender just like you with no add-ons added, just in the default stage. So what I want you to do in the next stage of this lesson, the next part of it, is we're going to go ahead and make changes to Blender. I'm going to close this up right now. We're going to go ahead and make changes to Blender so that we are working in a way that you can follow along in the course, so that I can set you up to be very similar to how I work. That way, when I give you instructions to follow during the course, you can see just that your computer is going to be very similar to mine in its setup mode. Okay, so we have to make some changes to Blender. Now, many changes to Blender that I'm going to walk you through here are basically changes that I've made to make my life in jewelry design much more easy, that I have access to all the things and only have things turned on that are predicated to jewelry design and 3D printing, because this has a lot to do with 3D printing in the jewelry industry. We'll cover that in one of the next lessons. So let's get started with changing our parameters. First, let's take our viewport. We don't need to have the timeline, as I mentioned before. So I want you to click somewhere in this viewport. And when you do that, you can move your mouse to the lower left corner, and you'll see it changes to a little plus sign. Click and hold the left mouse button and drag down, and you can see we've removed our timeline. We don't need that for jewelry design, so let's get rid of it. The next thing we have to do is deal with the fact that Blender by default works in meters. In the jewelry industry, we work in millimeters. So the end all in the jewelry industry is everything is measured by millimeters, except for ring sizes. But let's take a stone. A 1 carat round diamond is 6.5 millimeters. So we want to work in millimeters so that everything we do corresponds to the design limitations or the conditions that we need to design in, so that when we pass it off to a 3D printer, we get the right size models, and then when we send it to a caster, he gets the right size model to work with. Because you don't want to send a 3-meter ring to a customer, because obviously you can't print it and cast it. You know what I mean. Let's start changing everything to millimeters. Just follow along, and you'll see that this is relatively easy. And what I want to do now is come over to our properties panels and properties tabs, and we're going to start with our scenes icon. Now again, if you hover your mouse over an object, it'll tell you what it is. We're going to go to the scenes tab, and we're going to click on units. When we do that, you'll see that we are in metric. We have a scale of 1, and we are currently working in meters. So first things first, let's change the length to millimeters. And what that's going to do is basically just going to change the way Blender reports the size of an object. For instance, if we click on this cube here, we look at the items tab, you can see that our cube is 2 by 2 by 2 meters. So if I change this to millimeters, by doing that now, we have a 2,000 millimeter cube, which is basically 2 meters. And we have not changed the dimensions that we're working in. We've just changed the reporting method. So the next thing we need to do is change our unit scale. To change this unit scale, we're going to click in this box and type in 0.001 and then press the enter or return key. Now you will see that our cube is reported in millimeters only. So that's how easy it is to adjust our scale in Blender. But we have to make a couple more changes just to fix some other issues that we're going to have in Blender. Now, if you don't have a keypad on your computer keyboard, let's say you're using a laptop computer without a keypad, I encourage you to go buy one on Amazon and use it, because the keypad in Blender is a must-have function. You can't get away without it, but it's just something to have that you want to use on a daily basis. So what I want to do is I want to change the perspective. I want to look straight down from the top at our model, and that's the keyboard number 7. If I press that here, you can see that we're looking straight down at our model. We have a y-axis here denoted by green, an x-axis denoted by red, and we can't see the z-axis because we're looking straight down at it. But you can see now that this is a 2 millimeter cube, and we have 1 millimeter blocks that represent the scale or the grid size of our work area. Now I like to break these down so that I have a further breakdown of 1 millimeter divided by 10, so tenths of a millimeter, and I'll get a smaller grid within these large grids to denote that. To do this, we're going to come up to this tab here, which is the overlays. Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to come up to this tab here, which is the gizmos tab. We're going to hit the little drop down arrow, and we're going to click on move. And that's going to put arrows within our object parameters. And then we can just take these and move them around. So I want you to make that change now. And then we're going to come over to the overlays tab. And you're going to see there's an option here at the top called scale. Again, we're going to click in that. And we're going to type in 0.001 and press return or enter. And now you can see within our 1 millimeter cubes, there are 10 smaller 1/10 of a millimeter cube. Now that itself, that grid, helps us denote where we're moving objects. So for instance, if I wanted to take this and move it over 2/10 of a millimeter, I could do that, or I could change the parameters here, but it's it's up to you. I do a lot of free forming, so I like to have these grids here. Now, when you move your cursor and go at it from a different perspective, those small grids will disappear. They only work with a direct orthographic view. And if I click in 1 to look at it from the front, or 3 from the side, now these are the 1 and 3 keys on my keypad, or 7 from the top, you see we get those sub sectors within our dimensions on our grid. With that done, we're going to change one more thing just to make life a little easier. There is a little bug that has appeared in previous versions of Blender, and that is in the View tab. You can see here we have a clip start and a clip end, and what we want to do is change this clip end to something like 1 million. And I'm actually going to give it another zero, a couple zeros, just to cover myself. This allows us to zoom out and in on an object without losing or clipping the screen so something disappears. In some cases, Blender kind of tweaks out when it does that, and we're just kind of correcting for that now. Now that's how we work in millimeters. We set up Blender to work in millimeters. From that particular point, what I want you to do is come over to File, and go down to the Defaults menu option here, and then Save Startup File. And we're going to overwrite the existing one. And now every time that you open a new version of Blender, no matter what it is, you're going to come over to File, New. It's the same as opening up a new one. We'll go to General. And what happens is, I'm not going to save this, it brings in all our information. And if I come over here to the Items tab, you can see our cube is 2 millimeters and not 2 meters. Again, this is going to be very handy for 3D printing. The next part of this lesson is going to be setting up the user environment, or the UI, for Blender, and I'm going to cover that really quick here. We just want you to follow along. We are going to set up some parameters to adjust the way our Blender operates. Now, if I come over to Edit and Preferences, and I'm going to come over to Interface, you can see that I'm at 1.0. So my screen might look very small to you. I'm going to actually change this to 1.4 so that everything's a little bigger and you can see it better. Now, depending on your computer screen or your computer monitor, you may want to change this. You can click and drag back and forth just to make it whatever size you want. Again, I'm going to go to 1.4 just for the course of this video. Now, these are the parameters that Blender will have within its user environment. So for instance, we have an interface. That's the whole interface of the window, and we can change, you saw the scale of that. We have the splash screen that always comes on. We can turn that off if we don't want to use it. I'm going to leave it the same. Developer extras, if you're a developer and adding or making add-ons for Blender, you do kind of want this on, as well as Python tooltips. We're not going to do that. I'm going to leave user tooltips on because that allows us to put our cursor over something and bring up a little pop-up that tells us what it is. Regional overlays, that's the area here, and navigational controls would be these areas on the side here. So if you turn these off, you can see the purpose of that, and I'm going to leave those on because we're going to use them. There's nothing else here other than the status bar, and what I like to do with the status bar is, and follow me here, scene statistics, and you'll notice the status bar is down here. It tells you what version in the lower left corner or lower right corner, what the version you're using is. And we can change these to, we can add these scene statistics, scene duration. We're not going to use scene duration. We don't need that. But system memory, and depending on the memory of your computer, you want to have that turned on. Blender version, that was what I told you about just a second ago, and extensions updates. We're going to leave that there because anytime there's an extension update that comes in while you're using Blender, and if you're connected to the internet, it'll let you know. That's under interface changes. Now we'll go ahead and we're going to hit the Save Preferences just to store those. Now let's go to Viewport, and there's nothing in Viewport that we need to change just yet. If we make changes, it'll probably be during the course of the lessons in the future. Lights, we're not going to change. Editing, edit mode and editing, we're going to leave basically the same way it's always been by default. Animations, since we're not doing any animating of characters, we're going to skip that for now. Add-ons, get extensions and themes, we'll cover later. Let's go to the Input tab and see if there's anything here we want to use. Again, if you don't have a numeric keypad on your keyboard, you might want to either purchase a keypad to add to your system or emulate one. Now, I've always had a keypad on my keyboards. I'm not going to click on that because I already have the keypad. So let's move on to the next part, which would be navigation. Under navigation, and I'm going to just kind of move this over here. Actually, we're going to leave that on right now, just like this. Probably making that too small. We'll just put this off screen. So navigating in your 3D world or your 3D viewport, first of all, if you click and hold the middle mouse button, you can rotate left and right, up and down. And that rotates around the center point of the screen, not the object itself. If I could take this object, move it way over here, again, hold the middle mouse button, and you can see I'm rotating around the 3D cursor. This 3D cursor is currently in the center of your scene or center of your world. You can move this other places, and it will throw you off. So here's what I like to do. Let's take this and let's put it back in the center. And we're going to bring up our Preferences tab here. And what we want to do is orbit around selected. I'm going to put a check mark there. I'm going to hit the Save Preferences, and I'm going to move this off screen. For instance now, if I click on this cube and I hold my middle mouse button, you can see we're rotating around the cube. If I click on the light and I rotate, now you can see we're rotating around the light and not the cube. So that's what rotating around selected is. I always keep rotation around selected on because I like to look at a specific part of a model by rotating around it just to see how it fits into my models. So I'm asking you to do this because it's going to help you later. In addition, Blender has in the past, in some versions, had depth problems where you scroll into something and it locks up into a specific depth and you can't zoom in any further. To correct that, we'll click on the depth check mark here and we'll activate that. Again, we're going to hit Save Preferences. Zoom to mouse position. Again, so if I put my cursor up here and I zoom in, you can see it's only zooming to the 3D cursor or whatever's in the middle of the screen. Now let's take this and let's change that. We're going to zoom to mouse position. I'm going to hit Save and I'm going to move this off screen. And now if I put my cursor here and I zoom in, you can see it's zooming to wherever I'm pointing. Again, if you want to see the camera, you put your cursor over it, you can zoom into your camera. And it just makes things a lot easier to use and navigate within the 3D viewport. Now, we're not really going to change much else, but I will cover the system folder here. This is the parameters for your graphics card or your GPU. I'm using an M1 Mac with 8 cores. I'm going to activate the M1 and just leave it at that. My online access, it'll time out after 10 minutes. Its connection limit is 5 tries. Just leave that set up, and it'll work when you first load Blender, and then kind of stick or kick off of the internet when it's not being used. Let's see. There's not much else here. Memory undo limit. For instance, right now, everybody knows Control-Z will cancel the last operation. You have 32 cancellations or steps that you can go back. I like to change this to 75. Now that'll also be dependent on the memory on your computer, so be careful. If you have to change that, you can go back and change it later. Your save load, this is for save prompts. You always want it to have a prompt so that you don't overwrite a file if you don't want to. It gives you kind of like that last bit effort that you're not going to overwrite something. Relative paths, we're going to leave all of these the same. And under File Browser, which we'll cover in a lesson when we save and load files, I'll go through all this, but we want recent, system, and filter files in that. So then file paths, this is a little bit more of a detailed section of the preferences, but for instance, we can tell it where our fonts file is. If you have a directory that has hundreds or thousands of fonts, you can add the location of that, textures, sounds, temporary files, etc. In addition, since Blender 3.0, we've had asset libraries, and those are Blender files that you can bring in and link objects within those other files into your current file if you so wish. We'll cover that in another lesson. I think it'll be lesson 4 or 5, where we're going to set up our own library of things that we'll need. For instance, some materials and some objects that we use on a regular basis. So again, we'll cover that later. Once you've got all the preferences saved, go ahead and hit the Save Preferences button and close up the Preferences window, and you're pretty much good to go. And that's setting up Blender basically so that we can start using millimeters and your user interfaces. Part 3 of this lesson is going to be setting up our environment within our 3D viewport or our scene. Now, I like to take certain things in my environment and move them into a collection of objects that I don't particularly want to have accessible during my modeling, but are available within my scene. So we can see that we have a scene collection, which is everything within our scene. And then within our scene, we have another collection called collection. I know that doesn't make sense, but just hear me out here. If we right click on scene collection, we go to new collection, and it'll bring out collection number 2. I'm going to double click that, and I'm going to type in environment. Okay, within our environment tab, I kind of want to store my camera and all my lighting and any ancillary things that are in my scene that are never going to change. The reason for that is that I can move the light into the environment tab and my camera into the environment tab. I'm just going to move this up to the top here, and then I can turn this off with the little eyedropper here. And now I can't see it in my scene. However, it's always there, if that makes sense. I just don't have access to it. For instance, we can turn things off by clicking this little box here, or we can make them invisible or visible by clicking the little eyeball. And this camera here is for render settings. So for instance, if we didn't want an object to be rendered, we could turn that object off, for instance, the cube. And if I go ahead and turn the camera off, this cube will never get rendered when we do a rendering of a file. Now, we're not going to really do that with much here, but just so you understand what all these are, you can put your cursor over that and it'll give you a little hint of what it does. So again, this hides from the viewport. We're going to turn that off, but again, our camera and our light are in our scene. We just can't see them. And if we want to go back to them, we can just turn on the eyeball and boom, they're there. So with that done, I've got my collection here and I've got my cube in my collection. That's fine. I tend to just leave that the way it is. We'll deal with collections as we start modeling in one of the first, I think, lesson 5 or 6, when we get to modeling a simple object. I'll show you more about collections. Now that I've got that all set up, we're going to go ahead and go save our default settings, File, Defaults, Save Startup File, and we're going to overwrite it. So now when you go File, New, in general, it brings up that particular setup that you have within Blender, just the way we have here, and that's perfect. That's the end of this lesson, guys. In the next lesson, we're going to cover setting up the add-ons that we're going to need for Blender to use in the jewelry design industry. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up, share it, and of course, this is going to be part of, these lessons are going to be part of a subscription, or if you become a member of my channel or a member of Patreon, you'll be able to go and see all the videos. They're not all available to the general public. Thanks. Have a good day.